On March 6, 1930, the couple's youngest son arrived home from school. When he walked through the door to the home, he was confronted with a horrific sight. Within the home, Henry Jr. saw his mother's lifeless body sprawled across their first-floor landing. What was once a board game sold in low-cost retail stores that read, "Remarkable, interesting, and a mystifying game, great for parties," has now evolved into a sought-after piece of spiritual equipment for those looking to hopefully communicate with the dead. Ouija boards date back to the late 1800s and steadily grew in their popularity along with spiritualism after the American Civil War. Families grieving after years of death and strife turned to the talking board for a sense of resolution between themselves and their loved ones lost on the battlefields. To go along with that, the Ouija board was even shortly connected to a bizarre murder involving black magic, a philandering sculptor, coercion, and manipulation. It was the scandalous murder of Clothilde Marchand. Clothilde's husband, Henry Marchand, was a renowned Paris-trained sculptor who studied under the famous French sculptor, Rodin. Henry and Clothilde resided in Buffalo, New York in 1930, where he had become a specialist in dioramas and precision wax modeling. Henry had even made a career out of making models for the Buffalo Museum of Natural Sciences. Two of their sons and one of their daughters worked in the Science Museum alongside their father, while Clothilde mothered the other two children at home. Henry worked closely with Senecas, as he often studied the flora and botanicals of the Cattaraugus Reservation. He and Clothilde would occasionally stay in a cottage on the reserve when needed to remain on the land for Henry's work. Clothilde would gather wild mushrooms and spend her afternoons making her own sketches of the countryside scenery. The married couple's life seemed to be loving and even a model of perfection from the outside looking in. Despite this, looks can be heavily deceiving, and that was unfortunately such the case with the Marchand family. Henry began having an extramarital affair with a young Seneca woman, 36-year-old Leila Jamerson, who was actually one of Henry's models for his sculpting. Henry later testified that his affair was a professional necessity to make love to his Native American models because he claimed it was the only way that they would reportedly pose for him naked. The 53-year-old claimed he wanted to accurately depict the women's physical characteristics in his sculptures and felt that having a physical connection with them, such as having sex, would allow him to provide such accuracy. It's unclear if Clothilde was actually aware of the affair her husband had been having, but her otherwise seemingly blissful life with him and their children would soon be brutally ripped away from under her. On March 6, 1930, the couple's youngest son, named after his father, Henry Jr., arrived home from school at their family home on 576 Riley Street in Buffalo, New York. When he walked through the door to the home, he was confronted with a horrific sight. There, within the home, Henry Jr. saw his mother's lifeless body sprawled across their first-floor landing. He immediately ran to the Science Museum nearby to alert his father and two brothers of what he had seen. When Clothilde was first examined, it was believed that she had died from falling down the stairs. However, the examiner found numerous bloody gashes, the odor of chloroform, and the obvious signs of a heated struggle on Clothilde's body. It would later be determined that a hammer was used to beat her to death, and that the chloroform was from a soaked rag stuffed into her throat and nostrils, a means of paralyzing her so she couldn't escape the brutal attack. The police were puzzled at first, but determined to crack the case, they began their investigation by speaking with the person who was closest to Clothilde, her husband, Henry. After questioning him, the police were soon led to his mistress, the model, Leila Jamerson. Upon interviewing Leila, many red flags came to light, and the investigators were soon investigating another woman who had likely ties to the crime, a woman who was closely associated with Leila, a local, 68-year-old woman named Nancy Bowen, who was also a member of the Cayuga tribe. According to the police, after interviewing both Leila and Nancy, who both eventually admitted to murdering Clothilde, the grim reasoning for the murder made the crime that more horrifying. Leila had ultimately convinced Nancy, who was also known around the area as a practicing witch, to use a Ouija board to get in contact with Nancy's late husband, Sassafras Charlie. Together, The two women stated that by using the Ouija board, the spirit of Sassafras provided them with an accurate physical description of Clothilde Marchand as being the person who had murdered him. They claimed that the spirit also supplied them with the 576 Riley Street address to the family home, where they could easily locate Clothilde to seek their perceived revenge. After the summoning of Sassafras via the Ouija board, Nancy claimed to receive letters in the mail from a woman named Mrs. Dooley, claiming that Clothilde was a witch who had cast a hex upon her deceased husband, leading him to his demise, all the more convincing Nancy that what they had read on the board was in fact true. Now seeking revenge after being convinced that her husband was hexed and murdered by the local French woman, Leila and Nancy made the decision to murder Clothilde. While mustering up the courage, they unsuccessfully attempted to summon Cayuga tribe spirit warriors to carry out the murder for them. When the summoning continuously failed over a period of 6 long months, the two women settled for a hammer and chloroform as their tools to carry out the murder themselves. It's assumed that, along with the supposed and unlikely murder of Sassafras, Leila must have also had it out for Clothilde, as she was having an affair with her sculptor husband, Henry. It's also believed that Leila convinced and manipulated Nancy into believing Clothilde was her husband's murderer, so that Leila could have an accomplice and someone to carry out the deed for her. Nancy was easily convinced that Clothilde was a witch due to her habits of gathering and eating mushrooms, as mushrooms were deemed as strange, hellish vegetables, and in the 1930s, this could have easily been evidence of someone who practiced dark magic, as odd as it may seem. Their confessions now on record, Leila was arrested and she continuously implicated Nancy, who was said to have kept Clothilde's earpieces in her glasses, as well as pieces of Clothilde's blood-stained clothing, both pieces of evidence that she could not escape from. Despite her admission of being involved in the crime, Leila continuously claimed that she was nowhere near the scene of the crime when Clothilde was murdered, and that she had been with Henry on an early afternoon ride while Nancy was the one busy attacking and murdering Clothilde. Despite Leila's claims, though, after Nancy's confession, the police were able to determine that Leila was the mastermind behind the horrific and brutal murder, and they were both charged accordingly. In Leila's first trial, she reportedly collapsed from having a severe case of tuberculosis, which then declared it a mistrial. During the second trial, she pled guilty to second-degree murder from a hospital bed. However, during her trial, District Attorney Gary Moore called Leila a filthy Indian, which reflected the overt bigotry of that time. Then, after her retrial in 1931, Leila was ultimately found not guilty of involvement in the murder, despite her previous confession. Nancy Bowen pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 1 to 10 years in prison, but she was ultimately released after only serving just 1 year in the Erie County Jail. As for any possible involvement of the husband, Henry Marchand, Leila testified in court that Henry discussed wanting to have his wife killed, but Henry denied any involvement or conspiracy to kill his wife. Whether that is truthful or not, we may never know. County Judge Frank B. Thorne stated, "I believe, and I think everyone acquainted with this case believes, that Henry Marchand, though his affair with Leila Jimerson, which he cynically defended as a professional necessity, has a large share morally in the killing of his wife. I do not believe, however, that he is legally responsible. There is no evidence that he is." Henry, who was asked to testify in Leila's first trial, reacted angrily after hearing of Leila's acquittal. Judge Thorne stated that he thought the jury's verdict of Leila's case was ridiculous and a miscarriage of justice. He believed that Nancy Bowen was less guilty than Leila, as she was the one to fulfill the mastermind's evil wishes, and he then used this as a defense for releasing Nancy from jail for the time served. After walking free, Leila later moved to Perrysburg, Ohio, where she met someone there, ultimately settled down, and got married. She later passed away in 1972. Henry Marchand received a lucrative commission to make dioramas for the Chicago World's Fair in 1933, and according to his granddaughter, the murder of Clothilde was never discussed in their home. This leaves many to still believe he had a larger hand in it than he cared to let on. As for Nancy Bowen, It's unclear where she resided after her release from prison in 1931. Not much information could be found on her or her whereabouts, so it is unfortunately left to speculation. On the surface, this crime had been labeled as a Ouija board murder and even as a spiritual phenomenon, as we're still heavily left to believe that Nancy and Leila used a Ouija board to contact Nancy's deceased husband, who they claimed had accused Clothilde of his murder. But was the communication with Sassafras Charlie real, or was it simply Leila moving the planchette across the board as a means to trick Nancy into helping her carry out the horrific crime? The true answer to that, my friends, may unfortunately never come to light. So that was the case of the gruesome murder of Clothilde Marchand, and how the use of a Ouija board was the presumed culprit behind the barbaric slaying, leaving many, still to this day, questioning the validity of its motive. So definitely let me know your thoughts on this case, and if you have any questions regarding it, or any other cases I've previously covered, feel free to contact me at roguedarknesspod@gmail.com. You can also always reach out to me on my Instagram or Twitter, @rogue_darkness, on my website, roguedarkness.com, or you can stalk me over on my YouTube or TikTok for a whole new perspective on the podcast. It'd be awesome if you could share the podcast with anyone who you think would like it, and be sure to leave a rating and review on Apple iTunes, Spotify, or any other platform where you can let other listeners know that you enjoy the show. And I do currently have a little sticker giveaway going on for anyone who leaves a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. And all you have to do is take a screenshot of the review, send it my way, and then I'll send you some stickers. It's as easy as that. A fun little way for all of us to show our appreciation. And if you want some personalized shoutouts and other exclusives, definitely check out my Patreon by visiting patreon.com/roguedarkness. You can also always check out my Bonfire shop if you want to get your hands on some awesome merch. For references and additional information on the cases covered, you can find all the links for everything discussed down in the description box. And with that said, that concludes this week's episode of Rogue Darkness. The darkness is all around us, and I can confidently say that reality truly is more terrifying than fiction. Until next time.